Hello friends, this is Live Steel, Alexander Evseev, that's me. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to leave your comments because this episode is going to be interesting. That's a given because Dmitry Yakovin is with us today. Dmitry, welcome. Once again, so to speak, you've graced our channel with your presence. Thank you very much for that. Let's break down this topic. It seems like so much has already been said and discussed. There's so much information out there on the internet, but still, there are still questions, and on the one hand, there are even some interesting ones. Protein, this eternal age-old question. You know, like how much muscle will I actually gain from a whole tub of protein powder? I don't even know if people still ask that, maybe not anymore, but those kinds of questions still come up. So, if I take one scoop, that's considered one serving, but if I take 2 servings, is that actually better or not? For some reason, people still tend to think of protein as some kind of separate substance that specifically helps you build muscle, not really associating it with regular food. So that's like 1 scoop isn't really considered great, but 2 servings are thought to be better, and then what if you take 3 servings? Does that make it even more effective, or is there a point where it stops being beneficial? This is without associating it or linking it to other meals or to protein for gaining mass or not gaining mass. So protein in general, how much do you actually need, 1 scoop or 2 in the end?
No. Sanya, by the way, you quite rightly pointed out that people often try to separate protein powder from everything else. If we, by the way, analyze studies where the effectiveness of adding protein to the diet was examined from the standpoint of improving muscle mass gains, overall strength or physical recovery, we can even notice a trend in some studies where additional protein intake actually didn't improve or change anything at all. But when we take a closer look into the overall design and methodology of these studies, we notice that in those particular cases where people actually consumed the most commonly recommended amount of daily protein intake for athletes, it was precisely in those situations that adding commercially available protein supplements did not lead to any further improvement in the results. And in those studies where people did not get enough protein from their everyday regular food sources, the addition of protein powders actually led to improved results overall. And the effect was notably not dose-dependent. It was always limited by the fact that as soon as the addition of protein, together with the protein already present in the natural diet, reached this certain threshold, which is most often recommended, after that, the effect simply ceased to exist. In other words, once this recommended threshold was reached, no further benefits were observed.
If together with the protein supplement you end up getting, say, your 1.8 grams per kilogram grams of protein, you reach a certain effect.
It's like a plateau, so
increasing your protein intake or its dosage doesn't lead to linear progression. The result
is absolutely correct. That is, if you added 1 scoop and it was exactly that scoop you were missing, you were lacking. Up to the total amount, your result will increase, but the second scoop, unfortunately, won't improve the results any further. At least that's the case within the context of the recommended norm. But the recommended norms can vary significantly for everyone. That is, the amount of protein needed by a specific athlete. Here, we need to understand that it's not just body mass that determines protein requirements, but also the types of physical activity. Because we usually say that protein means bodybuilding. But in reality, it's not just bodybuilders who need increased amounts of protein. If you examine closely almost all elite sports, you will notice that their protein requirements, which are needed just for recovery, not for muscle growth, but simply for effective regeneration, are actually quite high. After physical exertion, these requirements are, in fact, often even higher than what is typically recommended for bodybuilders. Why? Because they train more frequently and with greater volume. And their workouts are generally more stressful from the perspective of metabolic stress. They are generally longer with less rest time between each of the exercises. For example, take wrestlers, for instance. The protein requirement just for recovery can be about 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And for bodybuilders, it's actually rare for an amateur bodybuilder to get any additional benefit from consuming 2 grams per kilogram. For them, it's often the case that at around 1.5 grams per kilogram, the ceiling is already reached, above which increasing protein intake doesn't provide any extra benefits.
Well, there's this common belief that the more you take, the better it is. I know people who go up to 3 grams, sometimes even 4 grams, really trying to get some benefit from it. But out of those 1.8 or 2 grams, how much actually goes to our own needs? After all, we're all made of protein structures. I mean, a human being is entirely made up of amino acids, after all. If a person has certain organs, it's not just that protein is needed for muscle growth, but also for the renewal of protein structures. So out of those 2 grams, how much is the minimum required just to maintain renewal? Yes, if a person, let's say, doesn't do any physical activity, doesn't need to repair muscles, but just for basic self-maintenance.
Right. Let's set aside athletes for now and look at how much protein is recommended for people who are physically inactive. Well, it ranges from 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram. So even if a person does absolutely nothing, they still need to consume protein because everyone's body is constantly in a state of self-renewal. Every single day, about 50 billion of our cells are broken down and then regenerated. In this way, we are able to keep our cells as young as possible. It's like, if you buy a car, drive it for 3 months, sell it, and then get another car. So you always have a new car. You don't even need to service it. You manage to sell it in time. And that's how our body works too. It doesn't let our cells get old. It constantly renews them. And cells are made up of proteins. So proteins break down and need to be restored. That's why athletes have a higher need for protein. Why is that? Because they don't just renew their cells naturally, they also break them down further through physical activity. If we are talking about something like basic walking, then probably there's no real breakdown happening at all. But any kind of sport where the results truly matter, whether it's endurance, strength, or speed, any type of training is generally demanding enough to create a significantly high need for protein. If you want to achieve results in strength, speed, or endurance, your training protocol will inevitably cause increased muscle damage. And accordingly, these damages need to be repaired. And what's interesting is that it's not just about restoring what was naturally lost or what was lost due to physical activity, but specifically about new muscle growth, new muscle tissue. In most cases, we're talking about bodybuilders, since for them, this is the main goal. Their training process is aimed at increasing muscle mass, and in their case, only about 7 to 10% of the total protein intake is actually used for muscle growth. Yes, we can just calculate it roughly on our fingers. But just imagine, Sanya, if a person gains a kilogram of muscle in a month, that's actually a good result, by the way.
Right?
That means in a year they could gain up to 12 kilograms. What is a kilogram of muscle? It's about 20% protein, the rest is water, some fat and minerals. In a kilogram of muscle, there's a maximum of 200 grams of protein. So in reality, by gaining a kilogram of muscle in a month, you've increased the total amount of protein in your body by 200 grams. If you divide that by 30 days, that's an extra 6 grams of protein per day. That's what you're accumulating purely for muscle growth.
6 grams of protein. If you break that down further per gram per kilogram of body weight, it's basically nothing.
Of course, it's basically nothing. And if a person isn't gaining a kilogram, if someone has been training for 10 years and their body mass doesn't change, by the way, seriously, just look around the gym. 90% of people don't change at all for years. I mean, they don't get bigger, they don't get stronger. So in reality, they're not building muscle, they're just maintaining some kind of shape. So their need for protein related specifically to muscle growth is even lower. For them, the main need is due to regeneration. But here, of course, even without making progress, you can push yourself so hard and break down so much that what might you need then? Even 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram. And at the same time, you won't gain a single gram of new muscle mass. For example, right now it's very trendy to combine bodybuilding with martial arts. And in many gyms, additional sections or areas are opening up where you can practice martial arts. And a lot of people are eyeing it, like, let me sign up, let me give it a try.
How does that usually go? Fighters come in and beat up the bodybuilders. A combined gym for bodybuilding and martial arts. Here, yeah, you really need to recover well after a workout like that.
But by the way, that also requires resources for recovery. But the point is, if you were lifting 3 times a week and then decided to add a couple more sessions a week, even just to do some wrestling or boxing, your protein needs will increase. If we look specifically at studies that examined the protein requirements of people who combine strength training and martial arts, the need is already in the range of 1.8 to 2.2 grams per kilogram. That's assuming the person is eating properly. This isn't about cutting or being in a deficit. If you eat a normal amount of fats and carbs, you should have 1.8 to 2.2 grams to maintain your needs and stay in shape. If you just lift weights 3 times a week, 1.5 to 1.6 grams is enough, but rarely more than that.
So if you don't have a big surplus, you don't need that much protein. And if people aren't growing, let's say after years of training, then often it's not because they're not getting enough protein. There are other reasons why they're not making progress. That's it.
That's exactly how it happens. But probably one of the least likely reasons is that you're not getting your 3 to 4 grams of protein. There's another interesting point here. We usually think that if you don't meet the recommended amount, then growth stops completely. No, it doesn't stop. It just gets a bit less pronounced. I remember when I started working out, I was obsessed with the idea that training only made sense if you got enough protein. It's only worth it if you're getting enough protein. In all other cases, it's better not to even start. But in fact, if we look more closely at the results of studies that specifically focused on whether a person would truly benefit from following a non-athlete's diet, that is, consuming between 0.8 and 1 gram per kilogram of body weight, there was always some progress observed in muscle mass growth. So really, what's the point? Well,
Where did it come from then, if the body, first and foremost, honestly doesn't care about your muscles, so to speak? Why did it still allocate some protein for muscle growth if it didn't even have enough for its own regeneration?
look, here's an interesting point. According to scientists, the reaction, more precisely, the adaptation of muscles to load, which is associated with increased protein synthesis, is so pronounced that the body starts to find resources for muscle growth from the limited amount of protein it receives. But since we provide little of it with food, the body begins to redistribute protein among different tissues. That is, the tissues that are more passive and utilized less frequently. They are also constantly in a state of self-renewal, maintaining their own structure over time. What happens during self-renewal? When protein breaks down, it doesn't just disappear somewhere into space, it breaks down into amino acids. Then, for the most part, these amino acids are restored back into proteins. And so the following situation occurs. The muscles that a person actively loads consume more of the amino acids circulating in the bloodstream. The more passive tissues, these can be, by the way, the tissues of internal organs, for example, or they can be the tissues of those muscles that the athlete doesn't train. And in fact, many people who go to the gym ignore certain muscle groups. For example, the legs, for instance. So let's say a person doesn't train their legs but only works on their upper body. Gradually, the legs break down. Amino acids are released into the blood, but instead of returning, they migrate to the muscles the athlete is training. And so the following situation arises. The legs slowly shrink while the trained muscle groups make progress. A redistribution is taking place.
Now I understand where this myth comes from. With bodybuilders, it's clear where it comes from. These are body parts they don't use. That's why it shrinks, and from there the amino acids break down and go into the biceps.
It becomes a donor.
Yeah. Now it all makes sense. Now it's clear where this story about bodybuilders comes from. They don't use it, so the amino acids from there go into the muscles to the bodybuilders.
Sanya, what I just described was actually studied in rats during scientific research. Why? Well, with rats you can just dissect them and see for yourself. With humans it's just much harder to observe how this happens. But the mechanisms themselves, that is, the protein metabolism in humans and rats operates through the same mechanisms, it's just implemented differently. But the fact remains, we know for sure that people who train and don't get enough protein, even if you go by the recommended values like 1.5 grams per kilogram, still make progress. Yes, it will definitely be less, no doubt about it. But it still happens.
1.5 grams per kilogram. I have 15% body fat, but the guy next to me has 40% excess fat. Should you calculate 1.5 grams based on total body weight?
Good question. Yes, that's a good question. I often see in the comments when someone says, I'm not getting enough protein, I tell them, relax, it's okay. All these recommendations, they're not based on total body weight, but on lean body mass or fat-free mass. Well, that's not entirely true. In reality, all the recommendations we hear, whether for athletes or non-athletes, are calculated based on total body weight, but within the range of a normal body mass index. That is, when a man has a body fat percentage of 15 to 18% and a woman has 20 to 25%. So if your body weight falls within these ranges, then these recommendations are suitable for you. If you have more muscle mass relative to fat, then you might need a higher amount of protein. as muscle tissue requires more protein for its maintenance and repair than fat tissue does. And on the other hand, if a very large percentage of your total body weight is fat, then most likely you'll need less. That is not 1.5 grams. If you weigh 200 kilograms and 2 years ago you weighed 100, well, it's unlikely that your muscle mass increased that much along with the fat. So you could say that the amount of protein you needed a year ago, just add about 10% to that, and that will be enough. Not twice as much, just a bit more. Our body mass doubled from 100 to 200, but only about 10% more protein is needed. But that's obvious because fat mass doesn't require it. It doesn't require a large amount of protein, but still, an increase in total body mass does raise protein consumption as an energy source. We move through space, and this creates increased strain, including on the thigh and pelvic muscles during movement. Additionally, any energy surplus that leads to an increase in total body mass will also result in an increase in lean body mass as well. For example, if you were to perform an autopsy on a person with obesity, you would find that their internal organs would also be larger in size, and even their muscle mass would be greater than average, based on their genetic background. This surplus itself directly stimulates protein synthesis. So because you're eating with an energy surplus, even your muscles increase a little bit. Well, you won't be able to significantly increase your muscle mass that way, but nevertheless, people with obesity in general have a higher active cell mass than average. And that's why this too may require some amount of protein, but it still won't be directly proportional to weight. So there are established protein intake guidelines that are based on your lean body mass. For example, these typically range from 2.4 to 3 grams per kilogram of lean body mass. But they are used less often and have been studied less. Why is that? Well, because most people simply can't just snap their fingers and easily measure their body composition. A scale, a bathroom scale, maybe anyone can have one. You step on the scale and do the math. But not everyone has the opportunity to calculate or measure their body composition. Moreover, even that popular bioelectrical impedance method is not the most accurate at all.
Whether you drank a glass of water or not.
Yes, it gives a margin of error. So basically, if you're not too skinny and not too fat, then your normal body weight is fine for you. Without obesity and without emaciation, that's the guideline for calculating your normal protein intake.
Protein can be either plant-based or animal-based, just like proteins in general. There are, for example, non-soy varieties. Is there a difference? There's still debate about the amino acid profile, like plant protein is considered incomplete, meaning it doesn't have enough amino acids, so you supposedly can't build muscle from it. This brings up the question about vegans and vegetarians working out, that it's supposedly a lost cause for them, because they supposedly can't build muscle since they don't consume a complete amino acid profile. So is there actually a really significant difference between plant and animal protein when it comes to building muscle mass?
If we look at various different measures of protein biological value, especially when taking into account both the amino acid profile and the digestibility of the protein, we'll often find that most animal-based proteins actually have an index that is even higher than the reference standard. There is a sort of benchmark indicator for this. Basically, it's an average amino acid profile that very closely matches the protein composition found in our own bodies. So first of all, it's very important to understand that all of the proteins in our body are actually different. Our skin, internal organs, tendons, cartilage, and bones, these are all one type of protein. Muscle cells are another type of protein, and they have a completely different amino acid profile. And when we consume protein in our diet, that protein is used not only for muscle growth, but also for all other tissues. But the majority of the protein that is lost and renewed throughout the day is still the protein of muscle tissue. If you add up from every single cell how much protein breaks down in a day and sum it all together, you can get a sort of reference protein. In other words, exactly how much and which amino acids we need per day in order to fully regenerate ourselves in a cycle. This is what is referred to as the reference protein. And what's interesting is that most animal proteins are actually even a bit better than this reference protein. So in fact, you can eat any animal protein. Now let's look at plant proteins. We have one type of protein that is very close to animal proteins. Soy protein, yes. And what's interesting is that soy isolate, in particular, the isolate, has a higher biological value than, for example, soybeans themselves. Why is that? Because biological value is influenced not only by the amino acid profile, but also by how well the product is absorbed. If you eat 20 grams of protein from soybeans but only absorb 15, then the biological value decreases. So you end up calculating your needs, but you're not actually meeting them, not because of the amino acid profile, but because the protein isn't being absorbed. Because beans contain anti-nutritional factors, like a lot of fiber and other substances that can slow down digestion. That's why scientists calculate for all sorts of different forms. Soy isolate is taken up and absorbed better by the human body. It's purified from anti-nutritional substances, so it's easier to digest, and thanks to its quite good amino acid profile, you could say that soy isolate is actually very close to animal proteins. And if someone is building muscle mass exclusively with plant-based sources, at the very least, they should consider soy isolates. They're available. They've been on the market for a very long time, probably about 70 years already. As for all the others, the second best in terms of quality and amino acid profile among isolates is, again, pea isolate. Its quality is about 10% lower than that of soy. And after that, of course, things aren't so great. If we examine cereal proteins, varieties such as corn, rice, wheat, oats, and barley, they provide about 50% in terms of nutritional value of what animal protein gives us. And it would seem that these proteins, well, not all plant proteins, but specifically these grain proteins, are about half as good. Well, maybe we need to account for them differently, say using some kind of index or just divide them by 2.
Coefficients.
Yes, for example, divide them by 2. Well, if that's more convenient for someone, sure, go ahead. But the point is, when scientists measured the protein requirements of ordinary people and athletes, they didn't separate proteins by amount or by animal versus plant. How much was animal? How much was plant? They simply took into careful account the total amount of protein that was consumed by athletes or non-athletes, and then checked thoroughly whether that amount actually met the body's nutritional needs or not. In other words, they considered all proteins. But what's interesting is that in most cases, 2/3 of the total protein in the diet came from animal sources. Why is that? It's simply easier to get a large amount of protein from animal sources. For example, if you're getting protein from grains, where there's on average 10 to 12%, just think how many extra carbohydrates you'd have to eat.
Yeah.
That's why people just don't end up consuming that much. So what's interesting is that if your diet consists of 1/3 plant protein and 2/3 animal protein, you can simply follow the general recommendations. And why does this happen? Why, if these proteins aren't very good, do we still get the effect from them? That's exactly the point. The quality of proteins has always been measured in laboratory conditions, in ideal settings that are different from real-life eating conditions. In other words, they measure the biological value of one protein on an empty stomach and then another protein. That is, in a person whose digestive organs are basically empty inside. But the thing is, so it's one isolated product on an empty stomach. But the thing is, throughout the day, a person doesn't eat only one single type of food. It's always a mix or combination of different kinds of foods and various different sources of protein. They eat animal-based proteins such as meat, fish, or eggs, along with some plant-based side dishes if those are available or suitable. Let's take a look at the recommendations for balanced nutrition. They state that a person, including an athlete, should get about 50 to 65% of their total daily caloric intake each day from carbohydrates. But where should these carbohydrates come from? Not from sugar, which contains nothing useful for your body, but primarily from whole grains and legumes. And these are so it turns out that at least 50% of your diet should come from carbohydrates. But when about half of your daily diet is made up of whole grains or legumes, you will actually end up getting quite a lot of plant-based protein from these foods. And whether we like it or not, our bloodstream does not receive protein from meat as a separate source, or protein from some grain as a separate source. It all enters the body as a single unified amino acid pool. So it's always a mixture. We say that under controlled laboratory conditions, meat is generally considered to be better than wheat. But in the bloodstream, there is neither meat nor wheat. There is a general pool of amino acids.
Accordingly, they compensate for each other.
Redistribution takes place. And moreover, let's not forget that there is a process of self-renewal. When cells renew themselves, they release amino acids into the blood. And there, it's a real mix. There are their own specific amino acids appearing in the ongoing process of self-renewal, plus there are amino acids from animal products, from plant sources, and also amino acids from previous meals. Most of our proteins are digested over 6, 8, or even 10 hours. If you had breakfast, your proteins are still being digested during the time when you have lunch, and we constantly have amino acids from one protein overlapping with another. As a result, a common pool is formed, and it becomes somewhat easier for our body to build its own proteins. That's why when we mix everything together, it makes it a bit easier for us to obtain a sort of universal general protein. And now, since you asked about vegans and vegetarians, let me clarify. If a vegan or vegetarian person eats a wide variety of different foods, such as legumes and wheat, or some other grains, right? For example, potatoes and wheat actually complement each other very well when eaten together. So, in the same way, even without worrying about specific combinations, just by eating a varied diet, it's easier for them to get a more or less decent amino acid profile. But in any case, if we look at the available research, vegans, not vegetarians, but specifically vegans who follow a completely plant-based diet, need to consume more protein than people who do not pay attention to this and do not exclude animal-based foods. But what's interesting is that if we're talking about small portions, say from 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram, a mixed diet definitely outperforms a vegan one. When we talk about, if you take, say, 1.8, from 1.8 to 2 grams per kilogram, there's no noticeable difference. But why is that? For a mixed diet, that's already more than enough. Even at 1.5, everything was already covered and all the protein was meeting our needs. But with a vegan diet, it actually reached the required amount of amino acids, but at higher levels. So it turns out that vegans can in fact train quite successfully if they make sure to consume a higher amount of protein in their diet overall. Yes, it's difficult to do that with natural food products, but if you don't have any prejudices against protein powders, then just get your 50 to 60 grams of protein daily from soy isolate or pea isolate. Nowadays, there are actually tons of blends available.
Pea isolate. Give a like if you've ever bulked up on pea protein isolate before. Here's a question for you. Does the absorption rate of protein from different types of foods, does the speed at which your body absorbs protein actually affect the percentage of protein that's ultimately absorbed and utilized by your body? For example, protein from eggs is absorbed 100%, while protein from meat, for instance, is absorbed at 80%. Is that really the case? Because of the product itself.
Yes. Look, here's the thing. If we're talking specifically about absorption at the level of the gastrointestinal organs, then, well, there isn't any data showing that the longer it takes to absorb protein, the worse, or on the contrary, the better it is. But in terms of symptoms, specifically those unpleasant and uncomfortable symptoms that are related to digestion, the following particular pattern has been observed. Almost all slow digesting proteins, the ones that take a long time to digest, like you mentioned, boiled eggs, fried eggs, or meat. So basically anything that requires prolonged digestion. Even relatively large single servings are generally well tolerated by most people without causing any unpleasant or adverse symptoms. However, if we're talking specifically about fast digesting proteins such as whey protein, for example, then a single serving of 50 grams of whey protein much more frequently causes unpleasant symptoms in people such as bloating, increased flatulence, or even diarrhea. That is, if you eat 50 grams of protein from meat or 50 grams of protein from cottage cheese, it's only in very rare cases that a person experiences any discomfort. But overall, even with this discomfort that some individuals may experience, and even with the presence of a laxative effect, most of the protein is still effectively digested. At this time, we do not have any data showing that people fail to absorb any specific proteins. Nevertheless, it's still unpleasant when this happens, so there are various recommendations. For example, if protein gives you digestive issues, try taking it with food instead of on an empty stomach. Try reducing the portion size, for instance, or in the end, you could even try switching brands. This can sometimes happen because different manufacturing processes may, in some cases, result in undeclared ingredients that can potentially cause certain issues. Reactions from the immune system.
30 grams of protein? Where did that come from?
Specifically 30 grams of protein, I don't know.
Where did that come from? Because the thing is, just a week ago, I was literally having a conversation with someone and he told me this, that You need to eat 30 grams of protein at a time, supposedly, and that any more than that amount won't be absorbed by your body.
Did you ask him, what if I eat every 10 minutes? Does that rule still apply or not? Because people say, at a time. But at what meal frequency is that supposed to apply? I mean, is it some kind of classic schedule? Some athletes eat every 2 hours. That too. But if, say, we're awake for 16 hours and eat every 2 hours, even at 30 grams each time, you could end up consuming over 400 grams of protein in a day, for example. Will this also be absorbed? Well, anyway, look, Sanya, what an interesting picture. In fact, at the present moment, there is no available data on what the upper limit for protein intake is, and perhaps even more importantly, what specific type of protein is being discussed. Because, after all, again, you correctly noted that depending on the speed, they can be absorbed somewhat differently. Which protein exactly? What is the maximum amount that a person can realistically consume at one time, without losing any of it during the process of digestion, or even losing it in terms of the body's ability to absorb and utilize the amino acids? After all, we eat protein not to turn it into energy, but to fulfill our essential structural needs. And in reality, there never was and still isn't this so-called upper limit. Where the 30 grams figure originally came from, it's honestly quite hard for me to say with certainty. It's possible, perhaps, that this is somehow related to data or research findings on whey protein. Here's what's interesting. Whey protein, basically, it's the only fast protein we have. That is, there are no fast proteins in our everyday diet. If you have protein powder, take a look. The single serving is about 23 to 25 grams. It won't be higher than that. It could even be 22. The recommended serving?
A single scoop, serving of 25 grams and 34
grams. See, that's where this number comes from. In the US, it's due to labeling restrictions. When they conducted a study on whey protein taken on an empty stomach because it is absorbed very quickly, a hypothesis emerged. What if it enters the bloodstream so fast that the muscle simply doesn't have time to absorb it? And then it would be excessive, it would be excreted or converted into energy. So it turns out that a person is eating protein inefficiently. So they started experimenting with the dosage. And interestingly, they noticed that for people of average body weight, which is about 75 to 80 kilograms, the single dose of whey protein on an empty stomach, Sanya, on an empty stomach. So why on an empty stomach? If other food is present, whey protein won't be absorbed quickly. It will be absorbed more slowly. Any food, protein, carbohydrate, especially fat, slows the digestive process. Specifically, this effect was observed on an empty stomach. Anything over 25 grams of protein led to a noticeable increase in protein oxidation for the body's energy needs. In other words, the proportion of protein that was used as an energy source increased. So the American Food and Drug Administration, which is basically the equivalent of our Rospotrebnadzor, said that a single serving of protein should be limited to 25 grams because taking more than that is not rational.
Wait, what do you mean? Proteins for energy?
Some of the proteins can be converted into energy.
Only through neogenesis.
No, not only that. We have amino acids that are converted into glucose, and there are amino acids that are converted into ketone bodies, or into acetyl coenzyme A. So not all amino acids are converted into glucose. Sometimes they go directly into the mitochondria and are turned into energy. Overall, both processes happen a little bit at the same time.
What do you think? Is it really true that there's no point in drinking 50 grams of protein at once? Because such an effect could...
If we're talking about whey protein, then we need to specify the conditions again. On an empty stomach. On an empty stomach, that's not like at lunchtime. Lunch is no longer on an empty stomach.
Lunch, you take 50 grams.
Because everything that was inside you since the morning will slow it down. And if it slows it down, that means the protein will be absorbed more slowly and distributed more efficiently to the muscle cells. And here's another interesting point to consider. If we take a closer look at the recommended serving size for gainers, those same supplements, you'll notice that a single serving of a gainer actually contains more protein than a single serving of regular protein powder. This is an important distinction to keep in mind when comparing the two types of supplements. They allow you to increase the protein serving when using gainers because gainers contain carbohydrates. Carbohydrates significantly slow down the process of absorption of protein and make its consumption more efficient. So, if your protein is mixed with milk, or you consume it during the day rather than first thing in the morning on an empty stomach, then the effect of protein loss when exceeding 25 grams is already neutralized. Moreover, it's important to note that the studies were conducted on people with moderate body weight, around 75 to 80 kilograms. If you weigh 100 kilograms, you generally have more muscle mass and more consumers of those amino acids coming from protein in your body.
For bodybuilders, this isn't relevant.
Again, if you come in and you're a skinny 50, let's say someone weighs 55 kilograms and goes to the gym, for them, a 50-gram serving is probably too much. And for some 200-kilogram bodybuilder, those 50 grams are the same as 25 grams for someone who weighs 75 kilograms. So you also need to take body weight into account.
Concentrate, isolate, hydrolysate. What's the difference? Is it even worth bothering with? Because I remember back when I started working out, hydrolysate was the most expensive protein. And man, it was honestly such a pain. I really wanted it. If it was expensive, it must have been the best, but I just didn't have the money. So if I managed to get even an isolate, God forbid, maybe snagged it somewhere on sale, I think, damn, that's like plus 10 to strength right away. What's the difference? And is it really justified to buy, for example, a hydrolysate or a concentrate?
Why is hydrolysate more expensive? Well, the main reason is that it requires more advanced technological processes to produce. You have to take some kind of protein. Most often, of course, protein isolates are used to make hydrolysate. Then it needs to be hydrolyzed, which means it must be treated with acids or alkalis as well as proteolytic enzymes in order to break down its entire protein structure and obtain a set of amino acids and peptides of various different lengths. Its only real advantage, which I would say is a rather conditional one, is that it's easier to digest and that it is hypoallergenic. Proteins, such as for us, are allergens. But if the protein is hydrolyzed, it does not retain the information that could potentially trigger a reaction from our immune system. That's precisely why hydrolyzed proteins are actively and commonly used when they are added to baby food or even to pet food. In situations where an animal or a child has an allergy or sensitivity to a certain type of protein. Hypoallergenic. So if you see a hypoallergenic product, it means that all the proteins in its composition are hydrolyzed. In other words, when it's impossible to determine what exactly is causing the allergy, they just hydrolyze all the proteins. This minimizes the risk of allergic reactions. And now let's talk about the aspect related to speed. A long time ago, Pavlovich believed that fast digesting protein was beneficial in terms of supporting muscle growth after a workout. That is, amino acids are absorbed very quickly and delivered efficiently to the muscles, and they immediately start contributing to muscle growth. That was the hypothesis, and it seemed very logical, and that's why whey concentrates and whey isolates became so popular. And hydrolysate, it turns out, is even faster. Whey itself is already absorbed quickly as it is, and if you hydrolyze it, it will be digested even faster. But no matter how much scientists tried to test this hypothesis, for example by combining whey intake in the morning and slow digesting casein at night, or switching them around, slow protein in the morning, fast protein before bed. After a workout, taking whey in one case and in another case, slow digesting casein. They always ran into the following issue. The total amount of protein consumed throughout the entire day, and of course the quality of the protein itself, turned out to be the decisive and most important factors in terms of results. But the timing of consuming fast and slow proteins remained just a hypothesis. In other words, it was an assumption, but it was not confirmed by research. And that's why hydrolysate is really easy to digest. It gets absorbed quickly. But if a person doesn't have any problems digesting protein, and if they don't have any allergies, then they can very easily and perfectly digest the same whey protein without any issues. Because for many years, I personally used to drink casein at night thinking it was great, that it would slowly release. Amino acids would, it sounds logical, right? Be released. I actually used to mix it. You know how I did it? I would mix it with kefir. Yeah, by the way, I tried it with kefir too, with kefir. And it turned into this kind of goo. I drank it and thought, this is just perfect. Then you think the longer it takes to digest, the better. Sanya, can I give just one more small example? Look, regarding the speed, what I mean is the importance of slow protein digestion. All of us, when we went to bed, would think about this, but you don't eat for 8 hours while you are sleeping. If the protein is fully digested while you're still asleep, it turns out your muscles have nothing to grow on. Damn, well, that makes perfect sense. But nowadays the intermittent fasting protocol is super trendy. They're spreading like hotcakes. All sorts of bloggers are recommending everyone switch to this protocol. And they're even recommending it to athletes. They say you lose weight more effectively this way and your muscles grow and develop without any fat layer. Plus, there are actually a lot of people in the world, specifically Muslims, who observe the religious fast of Ramadan, which is very similar. In terms of timing, it's close to the intermittent fasting protocol that many people follow. So in both cases, people eat almost their entire daily intake within a limited and specific time window. And for most of the time, they're not consuming anything. Now, here's what's interesting. Studies conducted on athletes, those who observe Ramadan, and athletes who practice intermittent fasting with a 16-to-8 schedule, meaning they don't eat for 16 hours and eat for 8 hours, but still get their required protein intake, during those 8 to 6 hours, at least over the 2 months of the study, which unfortunately is the only time frame for which we currently have data, as we unfortunately don't have longer-term data available at this point in time, these athletes gained as much muscle or maintained as much muscle as athletes who distributed the same amount of protein evenly throughout the day across all their meals. So it's still not entirely clear why it works this way, and the underlying mechanisms remain somewhat mysterious. So it's like not all biological mechanisms have been thoroughly studied yet, but the very important fact remains that we are simply not so dependent, especially when it comes to the process of muscle growth, on having amino acids enter our bodies every second from the digestive, at least not from the gastrointestinal tract, but through the mouth. Maybe it's because you eat a lot. Over a limited period of time, it's just that food takes longer to digest and proteins are absorbed over a longer period. But the very fact is, as I said, even if you eat for only 8 hours a day and don't consume anything for the other 16 hours, you can still recover and build muscle mass. So what can we say about nighttime sleep then? And even if you go to bed, and if you consume a meal an hour or two before bed, you'll only have a few hours when the amino acids from your intestines actually run out in your system. It's like at the start of my sports career, I got scared. The bodybuilding boogeyman scared me. With catabolism, if you don't eat, every 2 hours I wanted to drink containers. Well, that's how it was, of course, and it's still like that now. But still, there are a lot of them. There are now a lot of new young athletes, champions who don't eat like that anymore. I mean, they eat once every 3 or 4 hours. Yes, there's discipline. But discipline doesn't mean every 2 to 3 hours. It's not necessarily required every 2 to 3 hours, nor is it mandatory for progress. It's great when you're that disciplined, both in your routine, your training, and your nutrition. You won't miss a thing, like clockwork. Yes, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It just turns out it's not a mandatory requirement. So if it's difficult for someone to eat exactly that way, you can simply avoid it. Well, in my circle, there are guys who are really pumped, muscular, and they know what they eat, they know how much they eat, but they're not tied to any specific times. And so from the outside, it might seem like they don't really care. But actually, they take everything into account. It's just like, if I don't want to eat right now, I don't eat. If I want to eat in an hour, I'll eat what I'm supposed to. So basically, if we actually look at the overall scientific data, on sports nutrition, it turns out that things aren't as complicated as we think. That is, we often create restrictions for ourselves, including with protein, and make things more complicated with all sorts of protocols. You wake up in the morning, you need fast protein. And when you go to bed at night, you need slow protein. And slow protein specifically means casein, but the fact that eggs take longer to digest and provide amino acids to the blood for a longer time, we don't even think about that. But you know what I want to tell you? When all of these, you could call them stereotypes, these ideas and beliefs that were so common in the bodybuilding community when I was 19 years old, that's actually over 20 years ago now, all of this was around and I read it all. On one hand, these scary stories, they kind of disciplined me. But now, for example, I know that many of them are no longer relevant. And honestly, I just don't care anymore about certain things. Do you have to eat every 3 hours? No, you don't. I know that now. Is it necessary to have breakfast? Well, no, not really, Do you have to eat cottage cheese at night? Turns out not really, as it happens. And so, I just stopped caring so much, relaxed a bit. And back at the beginning of my, so to speak, bodybuilding journey, all these things were common and they kind of kept me in check a bit. Of course. I followed all of it, everything. On the one hand, maybe it was even somewhat useful for me. No, well, we're not saying you shouldn't do it that way. We're saying that in principle you can avoid it if you control your diet. But in terms of discipline, control, and more precise tracking, of course, it's convenient to follow a schedule by the clock. Because again, here's an example. Most often, when people are purposefully gaining muscle or losing weight, they consume the same amount of food every day. So they plan their diet for 2,500 calories with a certain amount of protein, fats, and carbohydrates. But at the same time, people expend energy differently throughout the day. For example, today is an upper body workout. Tomorrow is a rest day, then a lower body workout. So today I burned an extra 200 calories during my workout, but tomorrow there won't be any workout. You didn't burn them, and tomorrow you have a lower body workout. Your energy expenditure changes throughout the day, even during workouts, but your diet stays the same. So you could say that if you really wanted to get into it, you should eat as much as you burn each day and adjust accordingly. Yeah, but that's just plain silly. But on the other hand, it's much easier to just tell someone, from Monday to Sunday, eat 2,500 calories, and next week we'll either add or reduce that. Rather than telling them, just eat. Today, eat 1,500, tomorrow 2,500. But the main thing is that over the week, you end up with some average amount. That way works too, but it gives people too much freedom and they might start making mistakes. That is, to calculate some average daily caloric intake. In other words, it's easier to say every day eat 2,500 calories rather than 1,500 today and 3,500 tomorrow. Well, on average, it should turn out more or less right.
Look, I just remembered an interesting question. And right now it's being actively discussed on various social networks. It's about protein. For example, I calculate that there are 25 grams of protein here. I ate 2 servings, so I counted on getting 50 grams. But in reality, I got 12. Because you always have to keep in mind the important commercial aspect as well as the overall quality and reliability of the product that's now flooding the market, appearing on various online marketplaces, platforms, and everywhere else. I constantly see all sorts of reports and detailed analyses like, this is total crap, this one's just okay. There were even cases where out of the supposedly claimed 35 grams per serving, there were actually only 3 grams of protein present. So, things like that do happen. And here, a person might, honestly, just stupidly fall right into a trap simply because, damn it, he went and bought some useless crap and he's really working out, carefully counting his protein, but in reality, he's just eating garbage, some kind of processed flour product. That's an interesting point too, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You know what I was thinking? We're just having a casual conversation. People ask me these kinds of questions. Dimitri, do you actually know how much protein is really considered to be the right amount to get from sports nutrition products, from natural food? Are there any scientifically based recommendations? How much protein do you need and how much regular food? I say the thing is there are no such recommendations. In general, from a dietetics perspective, protein from powders and protein from food are the same protein. They have the same sets of amino acids. In fact, we could actually replace 100% of our diet with it. But considering the context you just mentioned, there's this point. It turns out that the more of your protein intake you get from commercial and questionable products, the higher the chance that you might make a mistake. So if you don't want to make mistakes, if you don't want to live with anxiety about whether there's actually enough protein in there or if it's good quality, whether the protein you bought is good or not, then make sure the majority of your diet comes from whole foods. Once again, we come to the point that protein powder is a supplement. It's an addition. It shouldn't be the main part of your diet because you can't really, you could take your protein to a laboratory. Technically you can, but very few people actually do that. And the thing is, even if you see that some branded protein, which a blogger sent to a lab, turns out to have half the stated amount, that doesn't necessarily mean the brand is bad. It could simply mean that the particular sample in question, which might even be a counterfeit product, is bad because many people do not actually produce real protein. They just make fakes under popular, well-known brands, and eventually someone ends up buying it. So someone buys a suspicious flavor that doesn't taste like the original and sends it to a lab. Then they say, look, BSN has only 50% protein, but it claims 82%. So, of course, you have to understand that not everyone in the supplement industry is honest, scrupulous, and trustworthy. And here there could be some kind of mistake. But honestly, how can you possibly put in, say 50, but you only put in 12? Why 12? Why not 15?
No, 25? Well, however much they scooped into the tea, just brazenly, straight from the bucket, that's what ended up in there.
But for us, let's put it this way, that overeating protein isn't that big of a deal. So if someone is worried and afraid that 1.5 grams won't be enough, or if they're concerned that they're not getting enough because of commercial products, well, you can always play it safe. Although personally, I think it would be more rational if you're worried about powdered proteins, then just don't buy them, and you won't have to worry about it at all. And we can't say that eggs aren't what they used to be, just like we say fruits aren't the same anymore and don't have vitamins. Well, eggs aren't the same, and neither is meat. There's no meat with less than 20% protein. That is, these proteins are encoded by the genome. In other words, if the gene can't synthesize a certain amount of protein, then that product simply won't exist. A muscle cannot contract if it does not contain between 18 and 22% protein. Therefore, no matter how you choose to feed a chicken, even when it is raised under typical farm conditions, and even if it gains a significant amount of weight in just 3 months, its muscles will still consistently contain about 18 to 20% protein. There might be more fat than under other conditions. It can store excess energy in the form of fat. But you won't get a situation where the chicken is big, but its meat contains only 10% protein. And again, if a chicken is well fed and lays eggs well, the total protein content in the egg, when you combine the yolk and the white, will generally be about 12 to 13% in total. If, for example, a chicken is underfed, it will lay fewer eggs. It won't lay empty eggs with less protein in its diet. Instead, it will simply lay fewer eggs overall. So it turns out that you should eat natural food if this is something that worries you, especially if you don't fully trust the brand of protein you're currently using. Well, instead of stressing over some percentages, I don't know, doing calculations, maybe there really is something to this, right? That there's perhaps some kind of, we factor in a certain percentage of bullshit.
I don't know, I'm bullshitting somewhere. I can feel it, you know? I feel it in my gut, yeah. Friends, here you have a complete crash course on protein. How, what, how much, and why. Do you need it or not? Does it get absorbed from regular food or not? Everything is laid out clearly. I think after watching this episode, you won't have any more questions left. Don't fall for unverified information or literature. Just watch Dmitry Mikoyan's Quality Podcast, where he always breaks things down to the point. Thank you so much once again for coming. Leave your comments about which topics you'd like us to discuss next. Give us a like for such a thorough breakdown of protein. This was Live Steel. Bye.